The city below was a sprawling carpet of flickering ambers and cold blues, but Elias barely noticed the view from the 50th floor. To him, the skyline was merely a clock, and right now it signaled 3 in the morning. Elias remained tethered to his mahogany desk, the glow of 3 monitors casting a ghostly pallor over his sharp features. In the ruthless corridors of the corporate world, Elias was a legend, the first to arrive and the last to leave, a high-performing executive who viewed sleep as a luxury for the uninspired. He prided himself on his iron will, believing that every hour stolen from the night was an investment in a future where he would never again have to look back. His relentless drive was not born of greed, but of a haunting memory that smelled like damp wood and tasted like thin soup. Elias grew up in the shadow of scarcity. He remembered the hollow look in his father's eyes and the way his mother would skip meals so he could eat. That childhood fear of poverty had calcified into a singular, unshakable belief. His value as a human being was tied strictly to his productivity. To stop was to fail. To rest was to invite the wolves of his past back to his doorstep. By sacrificing his present, he was securing the safety of his wife and daughter, ensuring they would never know the cold bite of want. But the body has a way of whispering before it screams. For months, Elias had been ignoring the persistent, rhythmic pounding behind his left eye, a chronic migraine that felt like a hot needle threading through his brain. He masked the pain with handfuls of over-the-counter pills, washing them down with espresso. A dry, hacking cough had become his constant companion, but he dismissed it as a minor annoyance. The milestones he was missing at home were growing in number. He had missed his daughter's first solo recital, her birthday dinner, and countless bedtime stories. When he did make it home, he was a ghost, haunting his own hallways. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Elias felt the crushing weight of his choices, but he viewed these emotions through a distorted lens. To him, feeling tired was a sign of weakness, a betrayal of the life he was trying to build. He saw rest not as a necessity, but as a dangerous indulgence that his competitors would surely exploit. This internal pressure reached a fever pitch when the most significant contract of his career landed on his desk. It was a deal that could redefine the company. The catch was a brutal timeline. 30 days of near-constant labor. Elias committed to 20-hour workdays for a month straight. He stopped eating real meals, relying instead on a cocktail of caffeine and high-energy supplements to stay upright. His wife's pleas for him to slow down became white noise. She saw the grey tint to his skin and the trembling in his hands, but her concerns were met with silence. The physical toll began to accelerate with frightening speed. His vision would blur, the lines of text on his screen dancing like insects. His heart would skip beats, fluttering in his chest like a trapped bird. On the final day before the massive presentation, Elias stood in the center of the boardroom for a final rehearsal. The air felt thin, and the fluorescent lights seemed unnaturally bright. He began to speak, his voice rasping, but suddenly the room tilted. The faces of his subordinates stretched and distorted into unrecognizable shapes. A deafening roar filled his ears, drowning out his own words. He reached for the edge of the table, but his fingers met only empty air. Darkness rushed in from the edges of his vision. The last thing Elias heard was the sound of his own body hitting the floor. He woke up minutes later, staring at the ceiling tiles with no memory of how he had fallen. The cold marble of the boardroom floor was a harsh and sudden awakening. Elias sat up quickly, the world spinning in nauseating circles as the blurred, anxious faces of his young team hovered over him like ghosts. He waved them off, his voice a dry rasp as he lied about skipped meals and low blood sugar. He refused the call for an ambulance, his internal pride shielding him against the evidence of his collapse. To admit he was broken was to admit he was dispensable, and in the corporate world, weakness was a terminal diagnosis. He adjusted his tie weakly, insisting he simply needed a moment to clear his head. He drove home in a daze. The steering wheel felt slick under his palms. He told himself he was going back for a fresh shirt, but deep down, he was seeking a sanctuary his body was screaming for. When he walked through the front door, the house was eerily quiet. His wife stood in the hallway, her arms crossed, watching him with a look of profound, weary sadness. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. Without a word, she walked to the hall closet and pulled out a nylon duffel bag. She set it on the bench between them. Elias looked at it, confused, asking if she was going somewhere. She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. She told him it was his bag, the hospital bag she had kept ready for months because she knew the day would come when his body would finally quit on him. This realization hit him hard, yet the fear of failure remained. He ignored the bag, grabbed a suit jacket and walked out, leaving her standing in the shadow. Back at the office, the adrenaline that had fueled him for years finally curdled into a thick, suffocating fog. He sat at the head of the table, the presentation projected on the wall behind him. This was the moment he had sacrificed everything for. But as he looked at the data points he had once memorized so effortlessly, they appeared meaningless. He tried to remember the name of the lead investor, but his mind was a blank slate. Silence stretched, heavy and expectant, as the board members watched him. His cognitive functions, once his greatest weapon, were failing him in real time. He tried to speak, but the words were trapped behind a wall of mental and physical exhaustion. Retreating to the executive bathroom, Elias gripped the sink. He splashed cold water on his face, but the reflection staring back at him was a complete stranger. The man in the mirror had hollowed-out eyes. His skin was a sickly grey, and his vibrant ambition was entirely gone, replaced by a haunted stare. He looked like a man who had already lost everything while trying to win it all. Leaving the restroom, he saw a younger colleague, vibrant, tan, and brimming with energy, laughing with the CEO. He watched as his boss placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder, a gesture of mentorship and trust. In that moment, the cold truth settled in his gut. The company didn't see him as a hero. They saw him as a burnt-out liability, a machine run into the ground and was now ready for the scrap heap. The vibration of his phone broke his trance. It was a call from his daughter's school. The secretary's voice was frantic, explaining that his daughter had suffered an injury on the playground and needed to be picked up immediately. Elias reached for his car keys, his heart hammering against his ribs, but his legs turned to lead. He tried to take a step toward the door, but his muscles refused to obey. He stood there, frozen in the hallway, a prisoner in his own shattered, failing, and utterly exhausted body, realizing with a sickening jolt that he was too physically weak and mentally broken to even drive to his child's side when she needed him most. The hospital room was a sterile sanctuary of flickering white light and rhythmic mechanical beeps, a sound mocking the frantic pace Elias had forced upon himself for years. Doctors were blunt in their medical assessment. His body had undergone a total systemic collapse, a final and terrifying warning from a heart pushed to the absolute physical and mental brink. Forced into 30 days of mandatory medical leave away from his high-pressure career, Elias felt a new, sharper kind of terror. It wasn't the fear of dying that kept him awake, but the excruciating fear of being still. To Elias, silence felt like a descent back into the poverty he had spent a lifetime outrunning. The first week at home was an agonizing exercise in both physical and psychological endurance. He would sit on the wooden front porch, his fingers habitually twitching for a handheld smartphone his wife had locked safely away in a drawer. Every resting hour felt like a betrayal of his goals, a shameful surrender to the weakness he despised. However, his body offered no choice. His legs felt like heavy lead, and his mind, once a high-speed processor, was sluggish and clouded. In this forced silence, he finally confronted the fragile reality of his own mortality. He watched his wife and daughter from the window, realizing he had been a ghost in his own hallways. Through long mandatory therapy and the honesty of his wife, the narrative in his head shifted. He learned that self-care was not an indulgence of the lazy, but non-negotiable maintenance for the soul. He began to see himself not as a machine to be discarded, but as a living vessel needing constant replenishment. Small acts became his new milestones. He spent mornings preparing fresh, delicious and balanced meals, actually tasting ingredients rather than inhaling caffeine in a rush. He took deliberate walks in the park, noticing the intricate and beautiful patterns of sunlight through the ancient oak trees. For the first time in a decade, he allowed himself to sleep for restful 8 consecutive hours. He woke not to a migraine he had lived with, but to clarity he hadn't felt since childhood. The ashen tint of his skin faded, replaced by a healthy glow that mirrored his internal and profound change. When the 30 days concluded, Elias returned to the towering corporate glass tower, but he did not walk with the hunched shoulders of a man trying to outrun his shadow. He moved with a calm and measured pace. He requested a meeting with his boss, expected to be immediately handed a severance package. Instead, he stood his ground with quiet dignity, laying out a handwritten set of boundaries. No more 20-hour marathons, no more weekend or late-night emails, and a firm commitment to his health. To his shock, his boss didn't scoff. The older man looked at Elias with newfound respect, admitting the company had lost too many brilliant minds to the altar of burnout. Elias wasn't a liability. He was now a respected leader who truly understood that sustainable excellence was the only path forward. He realized he was more productive in 6 focused hours than in 20 frantic ones. He was no longer the hollow, grey stranger in the mirror. He was a father who was emotionally present and a husband who was truly there. The final resolution was found not in a boardroom, but in a sunny and warm afternoon in his own vibrant backyard. Elias ran through the grass, laughing as he chased his daughter in tag and hide and seek. His lungs did not burn, his vision didn't blur, and his heart beat with a steady, strong rhythm. He breathed deeply, the air tasting sweet and full of new promise. He had learned that a broken machine cannot produce anything of worth. The greatest gift he could ever give his family was his own health. Self-care was the ultimate fuel, proving that even when you are tired, the very best way to move forward is to first take care of yourself.